Adam Stab is Baltimore's longest active graffiti writer. He's been formative to the culture of style writing since 1984. Since the mid-'80s, the movement of style writing or graffiti writing has become one of the largest, fastest growing art forms on the planet. Stab attended Baltimore School of the Arts and went on to build a long and diverse career in the visual arts as a graphic designer, painter, and muralist. He says if he's known for anything, it's being part of an era of writers that defined the Baltimore canvas style. Adam
Thanks to you, Beck, for having us this evening. We're gonna jump into talking about graffiti art and somehow or other bring it around to its little silver cousin of street art and its own little package. So my own story with regard, I moved here to Baltimore in and around 1983 and sort of immediately discovered graffiti. Just familiarizing myself with the city. I was really used to traversing the landscape on my own. I was a big biker and I traversed a lot of miles, living in North Central Florida on my own and unparented. And so the city was the first of its kind for me. I was born in Buffalo, New York, but I never spent any time there. I moved to the city in the beginning of adolescence. It was a little bit of a rough transition. Making friends is not the easiest when you're not a city kid. And I ended up, through my identification with graffiti and what in some, I guess, sort of strangely reminiscent of already having grown up with a little bit of skateboard culture and the mystery of what the inner city was supposed to be like. Graffiti represented this thing that I kept with sleuthing out until I found a community of people responsible for it, who at that time in the mid-'80s were a group of kind of disaffected but still affiliated MICA students, kind of on their own bent of inventing a scene, inventing a party culture, a place where there was lots of do-it-yourself arts of various kinds, especially the beginnings of the roots of what now is still Baltimore's worldly famous music scene of really, people determined on sort of self-development outside of a predetermined definition or a box. And so at that time, a lot of these people were the first handful of graffiti writers that were college-age kids to mine going into my younger years of high school. And happening upon their scene was the first of a place of making friends, of feeling like in an accepted group where I wasn't really picked apart as an outsider. I subsequently, when I moved into Baltimore, moved into the Lower East Side, which at the time was pretty strictly blue-collar, working class, in like intellect level of just how you were judged. It was not the easiest place to sort of cut the crust with the locals. Although I eventually did, and in turn, a lot of those kids ended up being my little first group of graffiti writing buddies. But through the discovery of what I felt like represented some sort of a connection to not just a sense of freedom, but of just an eminent knowledge of the terrain of the urban landscape that these people responsible for this scribe and scrawl all around the town, what that represented for me at that time in my life is, I think, the extremely important part of talking about what resonates in graffiti culture, because it's that call, it's that same attempt at capturing of a spirit, of something that is kind of, in a way, uncapturable. But what it represents is this ultimate sort of freedom and connection as well, in a strange sense, to the mystique of the urban environment of the city. And I think that long-lasting resonance is what has built on graffiti's longevity and its development into now what people call street art, and how we got from there to that packaging. The spirit of youth is certainly at the root of the original connection that the culture comes from. There was no time as any participants in history that I learned or figured out that originally the intention wasn't in the hands of kids. Kids literally who lived with their parents, who were responsible for whatever acts they were doing out in the public, and then going home to moms. In the beginning of the culture, this was inherent to the culture. It wasn't in the hands of young adults, as it mainly is now. It's very rare that kids young enough to still, be responsible for their crimes are doing it out of mom's basement like I was. Or like most of the people, again, that I grew up influenced by. When I was in 9th grade, the guys I was looking up to were in 10th or 11th. There was that much direct connection and similarity. So some of the things that is inherent to the practice, some of the things that are inherent to the environment that graffiti is found in, are very dissected into practices. And one of the things I think that's the most interesting about how it's viewed these days, or in a nutshell especially of street art, is that there's certainly not a lot of mention for the innocence of graffiti, which is still, if you think about it, the most important part, and always was, for its existence, is that lots of people in the world, maybe accidentally or purposely, even once or twice, are responsible at some point or some time for some type of graffiti, make some type of mark in the public for some reason, like when we grew up here, when I was first here in the city, and you would go to school, essentially on public transportation, all the school code kids took the MTA. We were all on city buses. We weren't all graffiti writers, we all weren't style writers, but I tell you what, kids rode on the bus. That's what kids did, like the bus was stained with graffiti. I guess all the girls, especially back in the day, they all had fierce handwriting. We would always jock the styles from the girls who also had names. They had little nicknames and stuff. So being in the city and what I refer to as being a part of, whether you know you are or knowingly or aware of being a part of what I call get up culture, it's just a part of some things that happen in the city. Getting up it's not that in and of itself is not inherent to the city. People do it all over. Driving trees is getting up. It's inherent to who we are as people. So that by and large is the largest percentage of people doing graffiti for the most part at any point in history. It's not meant to be art. It's just meant to be. So there's that in and of itself and in and of its innocence. And that was the original root for a long time to what became graffiti art, what now people refer to quite obviously or easily when they think of graffiti. They think tagging these big, three-dimensional architecturally designed letters and things. That was built on the back of the innocence of kids just getting up, of letting the rest of the world know that they had been through that neighborhood or up this avenue. It wasn't until, in the early 70s, I think around 72, that changed, and changed in the face again of a place where inherently the creative ilk of a lot of people exposed to what was happening in get-up culture were themselves creative thinkers in New York City. The way that history views and looks at people early on in the cities that had a writing scene that actually participated, and this is back when there was no documentation, they were not participating for the sake of being worried about who went to take pictures. They were just participating due to the fact that this was a part of the culture that was growing around them. At the same time as that sense of self-identification was burgeoning in New York, it was happening in Philadelphia, it was happening in Los Angeles, and it was happening simultaneously in a certain economic base of people in an urban environment who shared a lot of the same struggles and lack of sense of representation in popular culture. So, en masse, during the era of Black Power and Brown Pride, there was this turn toward rethinking, how you wanted to be referred to, and how you wanted your, especially neighborhood reference, your locality, your sense of representation in your own safe zone to reflect your feelings of thinking more or thinking next level about yourself. So hence these, all of a sudden, I'm gonna refer to myself as Sweet Duke, and that's gonna be me from here on out. And you know what, on top of it, I'm gonna bend my one Playboy ear just a little bit so that they know I mean it. And there's more to what happened during that time than was really purposely thought about, because a lot of the information was osmosis. A lot of it was people's own version of what was happening around them and the only availability that they had. Hence why people for so long have connected graffiti writing to hip hop culture, because of its built on its own, out of nothing, DIY nature. And the inherently important part of that is that it was connected as well to being born out of a community and out of a culture of people who were coming to terms with the importance of making the most of what little they had and finding the means to feel great about that, to think of themselves as beautiful, to find new ways inherently within their own community to critique, judge, and to jive with each other. And so the whole thing was born, all of what became ghetto fab, hip hop style, originated out of that being about all you could afford was a sweatsuit. Everything about the connection in the urban environment to that, in the graffiti writer realm, stealing hardware store paint because you can't afford art supplies, and you have no place to express yourself other than the side of a subway train, which shows it to more people than you're ever going to ever be able to do on your own. And the sheer genius and ingenuity and daring of that alone has resonated on itself. The trains are clean in New York City now. The kids all over the world do this because of what happened. Like, it's this resonating thing that, again, encompasses a certain amount of the frontiermanship, the willing, daring, the embodiment of that is what kids see. sometimes it takes them years to figure it out, but that's what they're, what they're looking for. Writers come and go, people think they know what they're doing. By the time the actual realization dawns on them, it's way beyond what they were planning for, so it's on to another way to figure out to find mates. But inherently, the growth of the culture, I think, truly my belief that on all levels is based on that resonance of that youth power, and to think that this was something developed in the hands of babes, of like underfunded, undereducated kids who were responding to their environment, certainly, responding to and I think to some degree, those practitioners, and God bless, I've got to know some. Some people who practice style writing, this culture has been very affected at times and very poignant moments by outsiders and people who are observers of the culture, not participants. I got Hugo Martinez approached a group of kids who are very, very responsible for pushing get up culture, who are originally from Washington Heights, Taki 93, and his group of cronies, the original guys, the original group of and approached them about hanging out in an art space and thinking about taking what they were doing to different levels, actually making art out of their tags, out of just writing their names on poles and trains. And so thusly, like kind of dropping, keystone into the thing in a moment in time, where quite simply it all changed into this next level of participants, critique in the community. And those moments continued throughout the culture where non-participants, through their being moved to action to some degree, to involvement, very heavy-handedly, whether that's their intention or not, affecting the culture. When Henry Chalfant and Arthur Cooper, who was a photographer born here in Baltimore, they shared the responsibility of the production of a book called Subway Art that came out in 1984. That book changed the world. And it inspired global participants immediately on a level of kids that had never even been exposed to graffiti art before. You'd never really seen pictures of New York City subway trains until that book came out. Globally. And it's not a thing to think about now, because it's such a common thing. But you have never been to New York, and you grow up in New York, you didn't know what graffiti was. When that book came out, it changed the world. That started to change the art world. It changed the lives. And to this day, Martha herself, especially was can attest that. How many people around the world, myself included, when she finally met, were like, Dad, it'd be no me without you. And so that alone, there's constant weaving in and out of popular culture that has affected this very underground community of participants, and thusly itself back around to the affect of popular culture through the arts. It's now, the era where it's not a strange thing for graffiti as it is to be finally kind of invited to the pop culture part. We've helped to swing open all kind of doors of, again, representing that urban youth culture push and connection that is effervescent, that is still resonating, that will always be, in the sense of people's desire to even understand, let alone have some piece of actually honestly representing that culture, which you can't. We'll see again. I'm gonna let you know you do. There's a lot to be said for being aware to the growth of how the responsibility factor of these different moments gave wake to all of the different now available poster boards of what people call street art. Because most of the ideas of what they do or have accomplished or represent are strictly that. It's ideas. There's some guys that have a similar understanding to the unique experience that some people actually like him to say that has at this time in history been bookended. I'm willing to make that argument with regard to, because I'm not one of these people who religiously connects graffiti to the elements of hip hop. I understand and will respect those that do, and I think it was there. I think it obviously played a role. There's no denying that. But there were a lot of people who were very early on, and again, some of the stuff, the forefathers of the Get Up movement that became graffiti art, they were around before hip hop developed, and were like Greek kids from uptown. They didn't have anything to do with breakdance, you know, but were they formative to the graffiti culture that having a handle and having a tag and like things like that was around as hip hop developed? Yeah. So it was there, it was present, but it was not one of the things that, especially in the same way, became as commodifiable or marketable as much of the other elements of hip hop became. And that's fortunately, God knows. But it's hard to put something illegal in that kind of box, you know? So that was easy to keep it aside from that as hip hop became commodified. But it's because of its commodification that I will raise, and I do raise the argument that hip hop culture exists. But hip hop in and of itself is sort of a moment in time for me, for those who were around when it really popped off. If you know and were there to feel it, it started and it kind of stopped. It was a moment in time where now you have all these things that it was responsible for, and all these things it created, and that would not have existed were it not for that moment in time. But it is not the same. It's not the same. That time come and gone. It's bookended. And I think there are a lot of old school cats that are still around that would feel the same, and you can talk to about it in that same light. Graffiti culture in some people's mind inclusive in that way, because it's like, oh, every bridge has been crossed and built, and like, you know, but kids who are into this now, and I say kids in the sense that, you know, kids to me, but these are young adults, they're not kids that go home to their mom's place. To raise the high water mark in graffiti culture is to, as well, you know, just be proficient in your willingness and your ability to be an outlaw, to understanding a certain level of criminality and adherence to what it's like now to do graffiti in the era of technology and surveillance, and to actually try to get away with something that hasn't been done, to do it better, to do it bigger. The technology has changed. It's a little easier on the mediums to get these things done, but I think that still the point is that people are pushing an envelope that keeps the culture alive, despite it also being something where you've got, of course, a huge amount of people just who again, meet with a certain level of what they were ever going to be long-standing for the culture. So that's, I mean, I think that a part of the importance of this is affect on what we now call street art, and let's just try to bring it around to that point, which has been a part of it, which is important, because it is not the chagrin and all of that beauty and that growth and that structure new voices in the urban environment, and I think that there are a lot of people who, for whom graffiti writing was always a connection to a certain amount of exactly that, willingness toward criminality that for some people, you know, it's a hard weight to toe when almost everything else against you is already pitted, you know, especially for people in the African American, Latin community, and on any low level of economic base in this country, to make a consideration of like, well, let's throw extra weight on my ability to get by deciding to break the law by writing my name on stuff. It's not an easy sell for a lot of people culturally, and never has been. So the environment is now opened up behind mural arts and people finding other ways, albeit influenced still by their experience in the urban environment, to like find that voice and to represent their experience. I think is, you know, it's a long way around the bush, but it's a great come around from where, again, some of the responsible, even if it's unintended, frontiermanship on the part of graffiti art has ended up, how it's come home to roost for a lot of people, because there may not seem to be an inherent immediate connection, but it's certainly there. And I think that where we're at now with regard to the culture of the history of graffiti and its connection in different urban environments like Atlanta, there's all kinds of people in the practice of like aerosol arts becoming the voice of mural arts. It's not just murals being painted, but then being painted in the same medium that was always the adopted voice and choice of graffiti writers. And somehow through that connection, just the medium alone, the use of spray paint, there's been this melding of accepted culture and accepted dialogue. I'm seeing the youth and its closeness in parallel politics and in walk of life with people.
Adam Stab is
Graffiti writing culture, but exposed to, aware of it, knowledgeable of it, and making their own decisions to a different direction. Now that street art and the actual participants in it still having some voice in this environment, in the urban dialogue, is kind of being accepted. So, it's interesting the way that kind of, it creates a stutter step for the relevance, I think, of some of the light that there's no point saying it should have always been cast on some of like the old school guys who never really got their just desserts in the graffiti movement and things like that, because it's like it's purposeful that people have to go through a certain amount of awareness and awakening, be ready for history. Sometimes, again, when the history itself is building momentum, it's building up energy to make change, it takes that long to make relevant the actual study of what happened and people who are responsible for it. So I think we're at an interesting point of that being what we're ready for, is that sort of background study. A lot of people have already done really good work of documenting the exact history of, again, the kind of change and the growth of the movement from getting up to doing graffiti art, and so thusly now the huge stage light of what is street art, you know, it pushes people's desire, I think, hopefully for, you know, for true history and for dissecting the smaller background facts from responsibility and timeline, dialogue. There's a lot still to turn over, and a lot of people to look at with regard to their influence of style. Responsibility to a culture that grew, especially without many of these cats ever thinking they would become longest inside connection to community art in this way, you know, and again, cross country from LA, Philly, New York. That's, I think we'll, you know, wind it up. It was, you know, I hope, informative for everybody, and, maybe a little bit more middle gray in as far as the background, not your like, you know, larger than like 3D color version of talking about graffiti. But that's sort of where I wanted to bring this around to, is some of the background essentials. So thanks again to the UB Blake for having us, and to the project for having me.
Do we have time for some questions?
Yes, we absolutely have time for questions. I'm going to pass the mic because we're recording this, we won't get your face, but we will get your questions. Hey, how do you like that?
Great. And thank you so much for your remarks. Would you give us a little bit of the genealogy of the development of the art form here in Baltimore City? You started by saying about 1983, and you were talking about some of the frontiers people. I would love to hear more about that.
So yeah, just to like throw a quick timeline of like our own scene out there. When I moved here in 1983, as I said, you know, like I pretty much, it was me and my skateboard. I didn't have any friends, so pretty quickly I got accustomed to seeing this stuff and knowing about what was on the street. At that time, it was a pretty small handful of guys who were originally from the northwest part of town. And there was a guy who was up throughout, I want to say like the Micah corridor, Midtown, like thoroughly, and then you know you see it here and there in odd bits and pieces. That's just getting up culture. Again, we were out and around the Beltway even. These people were from the northwest. You had a guy named Plaid was up, and a dude that ran with him named Romeo and Tron. Those guys were already, I think, right about the same time as I was moving into town, developing into a group called the Ghetto Strollers Incorporated, and referring to themselves as such. And it was like, you know, 3 or 4 guys. I ended up running kind of tight with 2 of their younger heads who were, again, as I said, maybe, you know, in 11th grade when I was in 9th. And back in that time, you know, we all communicated via the high school buses. We would, you know, we'd see each other's work on all the buses we would wreck. We would end up like meeting that way at different hubs. So Revolt was the first person to come here from New York City. He moved here in '79 and was here for the length of time I guess it took him to get his BFA at Michael. He did a thorough job of putting up enough work and gaining a couple of pen pals while he was here that, again, by the time I moved here in '83, the landscape was pretty littered with his work and the work of his cronies, which included a guy who's now a really, really close friend of mine who writes Cuba. He was one of the few people, he was the right-hand man to Revolt for a little bit. A couple of these other guys knew him, but they didn't run with him like my man did. They actually, like Revolt, taught my dude hands-on, and you can see it in what he's done. By '85, right after I had moved here, and I met Cuba once at downtown at the Punk Rock Hall, in the midst of a show. So it was very brief. And then right after, Cuba left town, pretty much permanently, and headed out to the Bay Area, where he became infinitely famous for being one of the first guys to bring graffiti writing, at least from New York, derivative style level. There were already placas in the Bay Area, which is like the style of graffiti that you find in the Latin barrios. But he was the first New York derivative style writer in the Bay Area, one of the first was my man Cuba, who came from here and learned under Revolt for the 4 years that he was here from New York. Those guys left behind a small handful of people who inherited sort of a style that was derivative to New York, particularly to the RTW group, the Rolling Thunder Riders, of which Revolt was a part. And those guys were the people that I spent a lot of time around. They were always at the punk rock hall. They were a Muck, a Knock, and a guy who was my hands-on professor for a while that wrote Dillinger. And again, these guys sort of embodied the crossover in our own version here at the time of get up culture meets graffiti art. They understood it through connection to Revolt, but were also these kind of disaffected MICA guys that had a very different bent on it. It was all, if anything, again, like that's why I say that, you know, it's like I understand people's connection with graffiti to hip hop, but mine was like, all the guys that I learned graffiti from were punk rock dudes in leather jackets, skulls on the back, and you know, we're into painting bizarro, much more dark imagery. And so that handful of folks, you know, there was a very small, very, very small group of people at the time in the mid-'80s that were even participant, you know, and you could basically swing a dead cat in the amount of space that you actually find graffiti. You know, it wasn't at that time, the culture was not what it had become even in this area now, where you can basically find graffiti under every single bridge throughout the Beltway. You know, there's somebody, some kid from like, whether it's from Essex or Dundalk or Arbutus, you know, tagging during the late 80s became the high school means of people doing something high school. For a while, it was Baltimore's version of like throwing rocks. You know, you didn't tag for a little bit in the mid to late 80s, and you didn't have an adolescence. You know, you knew somebody who did. And that, you know, that was how quickly it changed from the time that I moved here, met these few handfuls of guys that were influential, especially right throughout here. Like, you know, we're right in the wake here of where I would just like constantly skip school and walk around, look at the tags, you know, especially right through this whole neighborhood. But from that time to '84, when Marty and Henry's book came out, and again, it sort of changed the whole consideration of how to do it, what it looked like, you know, whoa, you know, I've heard of this stuff, and here it is. So, yeah, that was, those high school ages of being, as like I said, influenced by the GSI crew and the guys, the punk rock crew was called Mob Town crew, and all of those dudes were my major influence.
Other questions?
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about hand styles and why they seem to be different from one city to another and how that develops?
Yeah, the development in people's handwriting, and again, maybe it should be made clear for sure that, you know, one of the major differences between get up culture and just like, you know, writing Jane plus John on something with regard to like what graffiti is and how graffiti exists, to style writing becomes a certain amount of practice, becomes a certain amount of repetition and a desire for a writing style that one comes to the understanding is conducive to the eye, so that people want to look at it, you know, so that it's not uncomfortable to view. So what we do, and this is one of the things that I think people at a point began to think was a little mystic about the act, the practitioner, any practitioner, anything that you are repetitious with becomes, for lack of a better word, your kung fu. And you practice anything, doesn't matter if it's mundane, doesn't matter if it means nothing, you practice it enough, you're damn good at nothing. And so that sense of flow, of personal permanence and dedication and repetition to a certain emblem that represents you. Is not only something that you want to represent yourself, but inherently, to some degree, you want it to represent place. You want it to represent where you're from. Graffiti styles do exactly that, and have for a long time. When styles started out, and style writing started out much different than it is now. Within the community at large, like say in Philadelphia was, as I understand, the strictest, as you would ever find. If you ended up practicing style writing in Philadelphia, graffiti writers back in that day, you would recognize each other. It's not like it is now, like we owned the fashion. It was ours then, it wasn't on fucking sale. So you would recognize each other, you'd see each other coming, and like, oh, you write? Bing, 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 bing. So in Philadelphia, it was like if you claimed to write immediately by another writer, you would put through the ringer. It was like, oh, you write? Let me see your Wiggins. Oh, okay, let me see your Southeast. Like you had to have your styles on lock and on call, and you would get called out for not if you were claiming you were a writer. It just was not, you didn't, it went on beyond like, oh, let's do it. And in Philly, it was very that way. Like, oh, you write? Let's do it now. I don't care if there's people on the street. It was like they demanded adherence. Like in Philly is relentless and scary. Same in New York, where once style really became style, you started to really be judged on it. But moreover, the larger picture began to form in the national and international scene. The southwest part of the country, especially due to the influence of the barrio, and again, the long-standing roots of the placas there, and the styles, and the way that the letters are formed and shaped, influenced forever the look of the graffiti, whether you were gangsters or not. A lot of what came of the Southwest is strictly that, like styles that were kind of taken from people who were part of get-up culture, because get-up culture was very, and still very represented in organized gang culture. It has nothing to do with art. And you ask them, they will tell you, nothing to do with art, those styles and those
Adam Stab.
those styles of letters is property. It's claiming turf. The curve of an S, the drop of a D is the difference between Echo Park and it's that there's that again long-standing connection to a sense of almost a level of mysticism at the level of the power of written work. It goes without saying, the power of written word is what it is, but what if you can't read it? Then is it more or less powerful? Well, it depends on who you are, what neighborhood you're in, what you might need to know, wish you did. So there's all kinds of communication inside of it provincially that becomes inherent to the participant when you've been doing it as long as I have, and you know the difference between somebody, as you know I know, that I know, who's new, and trying to figure out why they're doing it, not what they're doing, but why. If you figure that out first, then you'll come to what. And if you get beyond all the W's long enough for us to judge you, I'll know where you're from, because you'll want me to know. If you're from Florida, if you're from New Orleans, if you're from Chicago, because it will be in your hands. And I'll see it, I'll know, because you studied your own history enough to know how you want to be curved. Because that's the depth of what provincial, real, personal hand style do. Once you're in it. And now you know that's the difference between cats who have earned a certain, you're doing it. Or you just get started and maybe you'll keep it up. Maybe you'll do what's required to be a real style writer, to like really be a writer. We judge like we judge people, because again, that's the difference between street art and our culture. there's an art to it, it's that adherence, it's that practitioner, and that desire to provincially be, to want to have people know, oh, that dude's from Baltimore, no doubt. And that could be if you're in Milan, you know, you want to rep.
Okay, we have time for one last question and a quick answer.
All right. That's the way to leave the room.
All right, thank you so much.